the dust of redemption. Texas tasted like broken promises. It was a fine, gritty powder that coated Martha Bell McGraw's tongue, settled in the creases of her worn dress, and filmed the wide, worried eyes of her son, Samuel. The sun was a hammer at high noon, beating down on the wide, rutted street with a merciless fury that seemed personal. It bleached the color from the raw timber storefronts and made the air shimmer over the horse troughs. To Martha, every pair of eyes that slid past them felt just as hot and unwelcome. She kept one hand firmly on Samuel's shoulder, a fleshy, heavy hand that knew the feel of biscuit dough and the heft of a cast-iron skillet. The boy, all of 8 years old, walked so close to her side that his cheek sometimes brushed against the worn calico of her skirt. He did not look up. His world had shrunk to the scuffed toes of his boots and the comforting, substantial shadow his mother cast upon the boardwalk. They had been walking for what felt like a lifetime, though it was only from the edge of town where the stage had left them with their single, battered trunk and the last of their hope. Hope was a fragile thing, Martha knew. It smelled of yeast and warm bread, but it could be starved into nothing. Theirs was nearly gone. Her late husband, a good man with a dreamer's heart and a lunger's cough, had left them with little more than a love for the open sky and his grandmother's recipes. The sky, it turned out, was not filling. But the recipes, they were all Martha had left. A gust of wind, hot and impatient, swirled down the street, carrying with it the sharp scent of horse manure, the faint, tinny notes of a piano from the saloon, and the cruel sound of laughter. A group of men, ranch hands by their look, leaned against the front of the general store. They were all lean, hard angles and squinting eyes, their faces burned by the sun to the color of old leather. "Well, look what the wind blew in," one of them drawled, "loud enough to be heard in the next county." He nudged his companion. "Looks like the circus is short a tent." The other men chuckled. The sound was dry and scratchy, like boots on gravel. Martha flinched, her broad shoulders hunching. She pulled Samuel a little closer, her fingers digging into his thin shirt. She had heard it all before. Every town was the same song sung in a slightly different key. Her size, a testament to years of lean living and the starchy food she could afford, was a public spectacle, an invitation for scorn. She tried to make herself smaller, an impossible task, and focused on the sign for the livery stable, her intended destination. She had heard the owner sometimes knew of work, but the men shifted, blocking the boardwalk. The one who had spoken first, a scrawny man with a mean little goatee and eyes too close together, stepped forward. His name, she would later learn, was Clem Pike. "Looking for something, ma'am?" he asked, a sneer twisting his lips. "Or are you the new kitchen just walking itself to its post?" The laughter that followed was louder this time, feeding on itself. Martha's face burned with a shame so hot it felt like it might blister her skin. Her stomach, already clenched with hunger and anxiety, twisted into a tighter knot. She wanted to turn, to run, to gather Samuel in her arms and disappear back into the vast, indifferent prairie. But there was nowhere to go. There was only Samuel's hand, now clutching a fold of her skirt, and the dwindling weight of the coins in her pocket. Survival did not allow for the luxury of retreat, so she did the only thing she knew how to do. She stopped, straightened her spine as much as her pride would allow, and lifted the lid from the wicker basket she carried. The scent of warm buttermilk and honey rolled into the hot, dusty air. "I am a cook," she said, her voice lower and steadier than she felt. "A good one. Would any of you gentlemen care for a biscuit on the house?" For a moment, there was silence, broken only by the buzzing of a fat fly. The men looked from her face to the basket, where golden brown biscuits lay nestled in a clean linen cloth. They were perfect, fluffy, high, their tops glistening with a faint sheen of melted butter. Her heart pounded against her ribs. This was her last stand, a flour and buttermilk prayer. Clem Pike laughed again, a short, ugly bark, "On the house, lady. You look like you ate the house." Humiliation, sharp and cold, washed over Martha. The heat drained from her face, leaving it pale and clammy. Tears pricked the back of her eyes, but she would not let them fall. Not here, not in front of them, not in front of Samuel. She began to lower the lid, the scent of her baking now smelling like failure. Then another shadow fell over them, larger and darker than all the others combined. It belonged to a man who had come from the livery stable, his steps slow and deliberate. He was immense, not fat like her, but built on a scale that made other men look like saplings next to an old oak. His shoulders were as wide as an axe handle is long, and he moved with a quiet economy that spoke of immense strength held in careful reserve. He wore a simple homespun shirt and dusty denim trousers, and his face was calm, his expression unreadable beneath the brim of a sweat-stained hat. This was Jedediah Hollister. He did not look at the other men. His gaze, a startlingly clear blue in his weathered face, went directly to the basket in Martha's hands. He stopped in front of her, the dust settling around his big, worn boots. The other men fell silent, their mockery dying on their lips. A new tension filled the air, thick and watchful. Jedediah Hollister owned one of the largest ranches in the territory, and he was not a man given to idle chatter or foolishness. Without a word, he reached down with a hand the size of a small ham and took a biscuit from the basket. He broke it in half, steam, fragrant and inviting, curled from its fluffy center. He put a piece in his mouth and chewed slowly, his eyes never leaving Martha's face. Martha held her breath. The whole world seemed to shrink to this one man, this one bite. She could feel Samuel trembling beside her. This was it, the precipice. Jedediah swallowed. He looked at the other half of the biscuit in his hand, then back at her. Martha's voice came out in a choked whisper, the words tumbling out before she could stop them, pushed by a wave of desperation and a lifetime of apology. I am sorry for bringing my son. He is a good boy. He will not be any trouble. I swear it." A flicker of something unreadable passed through Jedediah Hollister's eyes. A small, almost imperceptible smile touched the corners of his mouth, softening the stern lines of his face. He looked down at Samuel, who risked a peek up at the giant of a man. And then his gaze returned to Martha. His voice, when it came, was a low, quiet rumble that seemed to vibrate in the very planks of the boardwalk. "The boy eats at my table, too." He popped the other half of the biscuit into his mouth. "I need a cook at my ranch. The last one thought whiskey was a spice. You start today." The finality of his words was absolute. It was not a question. It was a statement of fact, as solid and unmovable as the man himself. He had tasted her work, found it worthy, and the matter was settled. Across the street, a fine carriage had pulled to a stop. In it sat Enoch Marbury, a cattleman whose land bordered Hollister's, and his wife, Beatrice. Marbury's face was a mask of sour disapproval. He and Hollister were rivals in everything from grazing rights to cattle prices, and he viewed any good fortune for the Hollister ranch as a personal affront. Beatrice, a woman whose face was pinched with perpetual displeasure, stared at Martha with open disgust, her lips thinning into a hard, white line among the silent ranch hands. Clem Pike's face had gone rigid with a venomous resentment. His sneer was gone, replaced by a look of pure, unadulterated loathing directed not at Martha, but at Jedediah. Jedediah seemed to notice none of it, or if he did, he gave no sign. He simply nodded toward the street. "My wagon is over there. Get your things." He turned, and the group of ranch hands parted for him like the Red Sea. They would not meet his eyes. Their brief, cruel courage had evaporated in the face of his quiet authority. He had not threatened them. He had not even acknowledged them. He had simply rendered them irrelevant. Martha stood frozen for a moment, the basket still in her hands, the warmth of the remaining biscuits seeping through the wicker. A single tear, one she had refused to shed in shame, now slipped free and traced a clean path through the dust on her cheek. It was a tear of disbelief, of a hope so sudden and overwhelming it was painful. "Mama," Samuel whispered, his voice small. She looked down at her son and managed a watery smile. "Come, son. We have a place to go." As she and Samuel followed Jedediah Hollister's broad back toward the wagon, she could feel the stares of the entire town on them. They were hostile, resentful, and sharp as shards of glass. But for the first time, they did not make her want to shrink. Jedediah's simple words had been a shield. "The boy eats at my table." 2. He had not just offered her a job. In front of everyone, he had offered her a sliver of dignity. They loaded their trunk onto the back of the buckboard, and Jedediah helped her up to the seat before lifting Samuel up beside her as if the boy weighed no more than a feather. As the wagon creaked into motion and turned onto the long, dusty road leading out of town, Martha did not look back. She did not see the figure of Clem Pike detach himself from the shadows of the general store's awning. She did not see him watch the wagon until it was a small speck disappearing into the vast, sun-scorched landscape. His eyes were narrowed, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. He looked from the receding wagon to the signpost that pointed the way to the Hollister ranch, and a slow, malicious smile spread across his face. This land, his expression promised, would not be a place of easy refuge. The rhythm of the Hollister ranch was governed by two forces, the rising sun and Martha's cookhouse fire. Long before the first hint of gray lightened the eastern plains, she was awake, moving with a quiet, practiced grace in the small domain that was now hers. The cookhouse, separate from the main ranch house and the bunkhouse, was her sanctuary. It smelled of old wood smoke, flour, and the faint, sweet scent of the dried apples she kept in a muslin sack. Her first act was always to build the fire, her large, capable hands coaxing a flame from kindling an oak. The fire was the heartbeat of the ranch. As it grew, its warmth pushing back the pre-dawn chill, the day began. The sound of the coffee grinder was the first note in the morning symphony, followed by the sizzle of thick-sliced bacon hitting the massive cast-iron skillet. By the time the ranch hands began to stir, the air for 100 yards around was thick with the promises of her kitchen coffee, bacon, and the warm, yeasty perfume of buttermilk biscuits rising in the oven. The first few days, the men had been silent and wary. They filed in, their faces still etched with sleep, and took their places at the long trestle tables. They ate with their heads down, their only comments the scrape of forks on tin plates. They were the same men who worked for Jedediah, but they were also men of the town, their minds colored by the same prejudices she had faced on that first day. She felt their eyes on her as she moved between the stove and the serving counter, judging her size, her presence. She said nothing, merely kept their plates full and their coffee cups hot. She would prove her worth not with words, but with sustenance. Her food was not fancy, but it was honest. It was hot and plentiful and seasoned with a deep understanding of what a man's body needed to face a day of hard labor. The biscuits were light as a prayer. The gravy was rich with sausage and black pepper, and the coffee was strong enough to float a horseshoe. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, the atmosphere in the cookhouse began to change. The silence at the breakfast table gave way to low murmurs, then to the easy banter of men who were well fed and ready for the day. The furtive glances were replaced by direct nods of acknowledgement. One morning, a grizzled old hand named Silas, whose face was a roadmap of hard years, paused on his way out. "Mighty fine biscuits, ma'am," he grunted, and it felt to Martha like a medal. The mockery she had anticipated never materialized. It was hard to mock the hands that fed you so reliably, so generously. Their respect was quiet, but it was solid, built one meal at a time. Samuel, too, was finding his footing. He was a quiet boy by nature, but the open hostility of redemption had made him shrink even further into himself. At the ranch, he was a small ghost, flitting at his mother's side, his eyes always downcast. The ranch hands mostly ignored him, not out of meanness, but because a small boy had no place in their rough and tumble world. Then came the afternoon of the harness polish. Samuel, wanting to be useful, had taken a soft rag and a tin of saddle soap to a set of bridles Jedediah had left hanging outside the barn. He worked with intense concentration, his small hands inexpertly rubbing the soap into the worn leather. As he reached for a new spot, the rag slipped from his grasp and fell into the thick dust of the corral. His face crumpled. It was a small thing, but to him, it was another failure. He bent to pick up the soiled cloth. His shoulders slumped in defeat. Before his fingers could reach it, a large, calloused hand got there first. Jedediah had come up behind him, his footsteps as quiet as an Indian's. He picked up the rag, smacked it against his thigh twice, sending up a puff of dust, and then held it out. Samuel stared, frozen, expecting a reprimand for wasting the cloth. Jedediah simply waited, the rag held steady in his open palm. He looked at the boy, then at the half-polished bridle. He gave a single, small nod. It was a gesture that said, "The job is not finished." Samuel slowly reached out and took the rag. Jedediah's fingers brushed his for a moment, his touch surprisingly gentle. He said nothing, just turned and walked into the barn. Samuel stood clutching the rag, his heart thumping. He had not been dismissed. He had not been scolded. He had been treated as if his small effort mattered. From that day on, Samuel began to stand a little straighter. The fragile peace of their new life was first disturbed by whispers carried on the wind from town. One of the hands, a young man named Billy, returned from a supply run with a troubled look on his face. He found Martha kneading bread dough, her arms dusted with flour to the elbows. "Ma'am," he began, twisting the brim of his hat in his hands. "You should know what they are saying in town." Martha's hand stilled in the dough. "What are they saying? Billy?" He stammered, his gaze fixed on the floorboards. "It is Beatrice Marbury, mostly. She is telling anyone who will listen that Mr. Hollister has gone soft, that he is letting his ranch go to ruin because he is distracted." The boy's face flushed a deep red. "By you." The words were a physical blow. Martha felt the familiar, sickening lurch of shame in her stomach. Distracted by her, as if her presence, her very body, was a weakness, a failing in the man who had shown her kindness. She had been so focused on her work, on building this small pocket of safety, that she had forgotten the malice that lay just a few miles down the road. The rumors were followed by more tangible worries. Jedediah grew quieter, a deep line of concern etched between his brows. Martha overheard him talking to his foreman by the corral. 2 newborn calves had vanished without a trace. There were no signs of a predator, no blood, just a set of strange hoof prints from a single, shod horse where no rider should have been. It was a small loss, but it was a violation, a tear in the fabric of the ranch's security. A few nights later, as Martha stepped out of the cookhouse to fetch water from the pump, she saw a flicker of movement near the dark silhouette of the shed where the lamp oil and kerosene were stored. A figure, lean and wiry, was standing by the door, as if listening. He was just a shape in the deep twilight, but there was something in his posture, in the sharp angle of his chin, that made her blood run cold. It looked like Clem Pike, the man with the goateed chin from town. As she watched, he seemed to sense her presence, turning his head in her direction before melting back into the deeper shadows behind the barn. She tried to tell herself it was just a trick of the light, but a cold knot of dread settled in her gut. The dread bloomed into full-blown fear a week later. The day had been unnaturally still and hot, the air thick and heavy as wet wool. By late afternoon, the sky to the west had turned a bruised, greenish black. The wind began to rise, not a breeze, but a sudden, violent gust that tore at the leaves of the cottonwood trees and sent dust devils spiraling across the yard. A thunderstorm was coming, a real prairie gusher. The men scrambled, their shouts swallowed by the wind as they herded nervous horses into the barn and secured the cattle in the lower pasture. The first drops of rain, fat and heavy, began to fall, hitting the dry ground with audible splats. Martha and Samuel worked frantically inside the cookhouse. She barred the heavy shutters over the windows, while Samuel helped her move the sacks of flour and sugar to the center of the room, away from the walls where the rain might seep through. Then the storm broke in all its fury. The sky opened up, and rain came down in solid, blinding sheets. Thunder cracked directly overhead, a deafening explosion that seemed to shake the cookhouse to its foundations, followed by a brilliant, jagged fork of lightning that lit the entire yard in a stark, blue-white glare. In that flash, Martha saw it. A section of the cookhouse's tin roof had been torn loose by the wind and was flapping violently, threatening to rip away entirely and expose her kitchen to the deluge. Panic seized her. If the roof went, everything would be ruined. Her stores, her stove, her sanctuary. As another peal of thunder rattled the very dishes on the shelves, the cookhouse door burst open. It was Jedediah, soaked to the skin, his hair plastered to his forehead. He carried a hammer and a pouch of nails. He did not waste a word. He pointed up at the ceiling where the wood was already darkening with moisture. He climbed out the window and onto the lower porch roof, moving with a sure-footedness that defied the slick, wet surface and the howling wind. Martha watched, her heart in her throat, as he hauled himself up onto the main roof. He was a dark shape against the raging, storm-tossed sky, fighting to hold the loose piece of tin in place. Each flash of lightning illuminated him in a dramatic tableau. A solitary man battling the elements to protect this small corner of his world. Her world. He hammered furiously, the sharp ring of metal on metal a counterpoint to the roar of the thunder. A particularly violent gust of wind tore at him, and he had to flatten himself against the roof to keep his purchase. Martha pressed her face to the window pane, her breath fogging the glass, her hands balled into fists. Through the rain-streaked pane and the maelstrom outside, he looked over his shoulder, his eyes searching the darkness of the cookhouse window. For a fraction of a second, their gazes locked. In his eyes, she saw not just determination, but a fierce, protective instinct, and in that moment, she felt a profound and startling sense of safety, a feeling that went deeper than just a mended roof. It was a silent, shared understanding in the heart of the storm. We will hold this place together. When the last nail was driven home, he gave the tin a final, solid shove to test it, and then skillfully made his way back down. He came back inside, dripping a puddle onto her clean floor, the storm still raging behind him. "It will hold," he said, his voice a low rumble beneath the noise of the rain. And she knew he was not just talking about the roof. The storm passed as quickly as it had come. By morning, the sky was a freshly washed blue, the air was clean and cool, and the world smelled of wet earth and sage. A fragile peace settled over the Hollister ranch. But Martha knew it was only a temporary reprieve. The wind and the rain had passed, but the whispers from town had not. They were gathering force, like clouds on the horizon, promising a second storm, one made not of water and wind, but of something far more dangerous, the malice of men. Market day and Redemption was a different beast from the weekday stillness. The town swelled with people, noise, and the smell of commerce. Dust was still the dominant perfume, but it was mixed with the sense of fresh-cut lumber, horse sweat, ripe melons, and the tantalizing aroma of roasting corn from a vendor's cart. Wagons, buckboards, and buggies lined the main street, and the boardwalks were a river of humanity. A churning flow of ranchers, farmers, townsfolk, and dusty travelers. For Martha, it was a trial by fire. She had spent 2 days baking, her cookhouse a warm, fragrant heaven of pies, breads, and sweet rolls. Jedediah had offered the use of a small wagon and given her the morning off, a gesture of quiet support that felt as solid and real as the coins he paid her with. This was her own venture. A chance to earn something extra, A small measure of independence that had nothing to do with the Hollister Ranch payroll. It was a terrifying and exhilarating prospect. She and Samuel set up a small table under the awning of the blacksmith's shop, a spot Jedediah had arranged for them. They laid out her wares on a clean checkered cloth apple pies with latticed crusts, plump loaves of sourdough, and a tray of cinnamon rolls sticky with glaze. Samuel, wearing a clean, patched shirt, stood beside her, his initial shyness giving way to a boyish pride. He was the official taster and the keeper of the small tin box for the money. Business, to Martha's astonishment, was good. The women of the town, who might cast sideways glances at her on a normal day, were drawn in by the undeniable quality of her baking. A taste was all it took. Her pies were filled with fruit, not sugary syrup, and her bread had a hearty, satisfying chew. She sold a whole apple pie to the banker's wife and 3 loaves of sourdough to a farmer with a large family to feed. With each transaction, a bit of the tension in Martha's shoulders eased. She was not a walking spectacle today. She was a baker, a purveyor of good things. She smiled at her customers, her voice growing more confident as the morning wore on. Samuel watched her, his eyes shining. He saw the respect in the customers' faces, heard their compliments. He saw his mother not as a target for whispers, but as a creator of things people wanted. When a ranch hand who had once been among the jeering crowd in front of the general store bought a cinnamon roll and declared it the best thing he had ever tasted, Samuel puffed out his chest. The pleasant rhythm of the morning was shattered around 11 o'clock. The Marbury's fine, black carriage rolled down the street, parting the crowd like a ship's prow through water. It pulled to a stop directly across from Martha's small table. Enoch Marbury remained in his seat, a stout, florid man who looked upon the world with the sour expression of someone perpetually overcharged. His wife, Beatrice, descended from the carriage. Beatrice was a woman who wielded her social standing like a weapon. She was thin where Martha was full, her face a collection of sharp, disapproving angles. She moved through the market with an air of regal inspection, as if searching for flaws, and she always found them. Today, her sights were set on Martha. She swept toward the table, her silk dress rustling, a small entourage of townswomen trailing in her wake like pilot fish. She stopped a few feet away, making no pretense of being a customer. She surveyed the remaining pies and breads, her lips curled into a faint, contemptuous smile. "Well, well," she said, her voice high and carrying, designed to draw an audience. "It seems the Hollister Ranch is so flush with cash it can afford to give away its provisions in the street." Martha felt a cold dread wash over her, freezing the warm glow of the morning. She placed a hand on Samuel's shoulder. The small crowd around her table fell silent, sensing a confrontation. "This is my own work, Mrs. Marbury," Martha said, keeping her voice as even as she could. "Done on my own time." Beatrice let out a short, theatrical laugh. "Your own time, my dear woman. A person of your appetites must surely spend all her time in the kitchen. I'm surprised there is any flour or sugar left for the ranch hands. I said to Enoch just the other day, the whole kitchen probably follows that woman's mouth, and soon the whole ranch will be gone with it." The words, spoken so clearly, so publicly, were a slap in the face. It was the same tired, cruel insult, but this time it was dressed up in silk and delivered with the precision of a stiletto. A few of the women behind Beatrice tittered nervously. The men on the boardwalk grinned, enjoying the spectacle. Martha's carefully constructed confidence crumbled into dust. The shame was a physical thing, a hot, suffocating blanket. She wanted to pack her things, to hide, to simply cease to exist. But then, a small voice, trembling with outrage, piped up from beside her. "You leave her alone." It was Samuel. He had stepped out from behind the table, his small fists clenched at his sides, his face pale with a fury that momentarily eclipsed his fear. He glared at the elegantly dressed woman who towered over him. My mama is the best cook in the whole territory. She works harder than anyone." Beatrice looked down at him as if he were an insect. Her thin eyebrows rose in mock surprise. "Oh, it speaks. How charming." The raw, unrestrained laughter of the crowd was the answer. They laughed at the small boy, at his fierce, useless defense. They laughed at the absurdity of it. The mouse roaring at the cat. Samuel's face went from pale to crimson. His defiance faltered, his eyes filling with tears of helpless frustration. He looked at his mother, his expression a mixture of apology and despair. And in that moment, something inside Martha shifted. The shame did not vanish, but it was suddenly joined by a hot, protective anger that was stronger. They could laugh at her, but they would not laugh at her son. Before she could speak, a calm, low voice cut through the laughter as cleanly as a knife. "He is right." Jedediah Hollister had appeared, seemingly from nowhere. He had been negotiating for a new bull with a rancher down the street, but the sound of the commotion had drawn him over. He moved through the crowd, which parted for him with a new, respectful urgency. He did not look at Beatrice Marbury. He did not look at the gawking townspeople. He walked directly to the small table and came to a stop beside Samuel. He placed a heavy hand on the boy's trembling shoulder, a gesture of immense, grounding reassurance. The laughter died completely, replaced by a thick, uneasy silence. Jedediah looked at Beatrice, his blue eyes as cold and flat as winter ice. "The boy eats at my table," he said, his voice quiet. "Yet every person in the street heard him. His mother keeps us all alive." He let the words hang in the air. He was not just defending her. He was declaring her essential. He was turning Beatrice's insult on its head, transforming Martha from a liability into the very pillar that supported his entire operation. No one dared to meet his gaze. Beatrice's face, for the first time, lost its composure. A splotchy, red anger bloomed on her cheeks. She had been publicly countered, her power checked by a man whose quiet authority far outweighed her shrill pronouncements. Without another word, she spun on her heel and marched back to her carriage, her entourage scattering in her wake. Enoch Marbury shot a venomous glare at Jedediah before snapping the reins and pulling the carriage away with a lurch. Jedediah's hand remained on Samuel's shoulder for a moment longer. He gave the boy a gentle squeeze, then turned to Martha. "Pack up your things," he said softly. "We will go home." They packed in silence, the townspeople avoiding their eyes, shuffling away with a newfound interest in the contents of other stalls. As Martha folded her checkered cloth, Jedediah loaded their empty baskets and the unsold loaf of bread onto his wagon. Near the spot where the Marbury's carriage had stood, something on the ground caught her eye. It was a small, grimy piece of thick twine, about 6 inches long. Curious, she bent down and picked it up. It was stiff and sticky to the touch. It smelled strongly of pine resin, but there was another, sharper, more volatile scent underneath it, something like kerosene. It felt oily, purposefully saturated. It was not a piece of twine that had broken by accident. It felt like a tool, something prepared. She looked at the deep tracks the Marbury's carriage wheels had left in the dust. The twine had been lying right beside them. A cold unease trickled down her spine. She quickly tucked the piece of twine into her apron pocket, her mind racing with a suspicion she could not yet name. The ride back to the ranch was quiet. Samuel, exhausted by his emotional ordeal, fell asleep between them, his head leaning against his mother's arm. Jedediah held the reins, his large hands gentle on the leather, his gaze fixed on the endless horizon. The silence was not uncomfortable. It was a shared space, a quiet acknowledgement of the battle that had just been fought and won. Martha looked out at the rolling grasslands, the memory of the crowd's laughter still ringing in her ears. But for the first time, the memory did not make her feel small. It made her feel angry, and the anger was clean, like a prairie fire that burns away the dead grass to make way for new growth. Jedediah had not rescued her. He had stood with her. He had given her son's courage a place to land. He had given her truth a voice. She sat up straighter on the hard wagon seat, her head held high, the sun warm on her face. For the first time in as long as she could remember, she felt no need to apologize for the space she occupied in the world. That evening, long after the sun had set and the ranch had settled into the deep quiet of the night, Jedediah stood on the porch of the main house. He stared out into the darkness, in the direction of the distant lights of the Marbury homestead. The air was cool and still, but he felt no peace. He thought of Beatrice's venomous words, of Enoch's hateful glare, and of the cold, calculated cruelty aimed at a woman and a child whose only crime was to exist. The piece of twine Martha had shown him lay heavy in his mind. Words were one thing. They could wound, they could humiliate, but resin and oil were another thing entirely. They were the language of destruction. He looked up at the vast, star-dusted sky, a cold certainty settling in his heart. The whispers had become shouts. The glares had become open threats. This was not over. It was just the beginning. "Will they try to start the fire with words?" he murmured to the darkness. Or with something else. The dry season was coming. You could feel it in the air. A brittle, thirsty quality that stole the moisture from your skin and made the distant mesas shimmer with a false promise of water. The tall prairie grass, once green and supple, was curing to a pale. Silvery gold. It was beautiful, but it was the beauty of a loaded gun. The ranchers on the plains spoke of two seasons, the growing season and the fire season. The fire season was upon them. Jedediah had the men working from sunup to sundown, cutting wide fire breaks around the ranch's perimeter, clearing brush away from the barn and outbuildings, and checking the water barrels. The mood was tense, watchful. Every man understood the threat. A stray spark from a horseshoe, a bolt of dry lightning, or a carelessly dropped match could turn their world into a roaring, black-skied hell in a matter of minutes. Martha felt the tension in her own way. Her work in the cookhouse took on a new urgency. She was not just feeding men, she was fueling a small army defending itself against an invisible enemy. She kept a pot of coffee on the stove all day and made sure there were always sandwiches wrapped in wax paper for the men working the fire lines. The twine she had found in town stayed tucked away in a small wooden box in her room. A secret, ugly little reminder that the greatest threat might not come from nature at all. Her unease led her to walk the grounds in the late afternoons. After the main meal was served and the kitchen was clean, she told herself she was looking for wild herbs, but she knew she was really scanning for anything out of place. It was on one of these walks that she found the second sign, near the rear wall of the massive hay barn, a place shielded from the view of the main house. She caught the sharp, unmistakable scent of kerosene. The ground was darker there, a greasy stain soaking into the parched earth, and scattered in the dust were small, dark fragments of what looked like the same kind of resin-soaked twine. Her blood ran cold. This was not carelessness, this was preparation. As she stood there, her heart hammering against her ribs, a figure rounded the corner of the barn. It was Clem Pike. He stopped short when he saw her, his eyes widening in surprise before narrowing into his familiar, hateful squint. "What are you doing back here?" he demanded, his tone aggressive. "I could ask you the same thing, Mr. Pike," Martha said, her voice steady despite the fear coiling in her stomach. "I thought you were working the north fire break with the others." "Foreman sent me back for a new shovel handle," he snapped, holding up a broken piece of wood as if it were proof. The old one split, but his eyes darted to the stained ground where she was looking, and a flicker of panic crossed his face. He was a bad liar. There was no reason to come around the back of the barn to get to the tool shed. "You should be careful," Martha said, looking pointedly at the oily patch. "It seems someone has been careless with the lamp oil. A place like this could go up in a flash." Clem's face hardened. "Maybe some things are meant to burn," he sneered, before turning and stalking away toward the tool shed, his back rigid with anger. Martha watched him go, the cold certainty in her gut solidifying into a hard, heavy stone. The fire came 2 nights later. It was not the roaring inferno she had feared, but something smaller, stealthier. A yell from the night watchman woke the ranch. A pile of greasy rags stacked against the base of the hay barn's wall was smoldering, a small, hungry fire eating its way toward the dry timber. The scene exploded into organized chaos. Men poured from the bunkhouse, pulling on boots and grabbing buckets. Jedediah was there first, his voice a low, commanding roar that cut through the sleepy confusion. He organized a bucket brigade from the main water trough, the men forming a human chain. The fire was small, but it was stubborn. Fed by the oil in the rags, it licked at the lowest plank of the barn, which began to blacken and smoke. Without hesitation, Jedediah grabbed a heavy horse blanket from a nearby fence, soaked it in the trough, and charged the flames, beating at them with the heavy, wet wool. Sparks flew, and the acrid smoke billowed into his face. He grunted as a flaming piece of rag fell onto his forearm, but he did not stop until the last ember was extinguished. The immediate danger was over, but the aftermath was a scene of nervous energy and simmering anger. The men stood around, breathing heavily, the empty buckets at their feet. The air was thick with the smell of smoke and wet ash. Jedediah stood examining his arm, a nasty, red burn, already beginning to blister, stretched from his wrist to his elbow. Martha, who had rushed out with the others, saw the injury and felt a surge of something fierce and proprietary. Before anyone else could move, she took charge. Her voice, usually calm and reserved, rang out with the same authority she used in her kitchen. "Billy, you and Silas, get more water. Douse this whole wall, top to bottom. I do not want a single hot spot left. Samuel, you stand with them. Pass the buckets. You stand in the line, son, not behind me. You two." She pointed to a pair of younger hands. "Get shovels and turn over this dirt. Bury the ashes." The men, accustomed to following her orders at mealtime, responded without question. Her commands were logical, direct, and born of a crisis. She had created order where there was none. For the first time, she was not just the cook, she was a commander. She turned to Jedediah. "You come with me. That arm needs tending." He looked at her, his face grim in the moonlight, and for a moment, she thought he might refuse, but he saw the resolute set of her jaw and gave a single, weary nod. He followed her to the cookhouse. Inside, she lit a lamp and gently pushed him into a chair. She washed his arm with cool water and soap, her touch surprisingly gentle for such large hands. He winced as she cleaned the grime from the burn, but he did not pull away. She worked in silence, her movements efficient and focused. She slathered the burn with a thick layer of a salve made from comfrey and lard that she kept for kitchen accidents, then wrapped it loosely with a strip of clean linen torn from a worn-out apron. "Thank you, Martha," he said, his voice low. He looked at his bandaged arm, then up at her. "You did good out there." "I just did what needed doing," she replied, her eyes meeting his. In the quiet, lamplit kitchen, with the smell of smoke still clinging to them, a new level of understanding passed between them. It was the shared intimacy of having faced a threat together. The next morning, the tension on the ranch was thicker than smoke. Everyone knew it had been arson. Clem Pike was sullen and withdrawn, avoiding everyone's gaze. As the men filed in for breakfast, he swaggered over to the counter where Martha was serving oatmeal. "Heard you were playing nursemaid last night," he said, loud enough for the others to hear. "Got to keep the big boss happy, I suppose. It must take a whole side of bacon to keep a woman your size satisfied." The room fell silent. The men stopped eating, their spoons hovering over their bowls. This was a direct challenge, a public insult aimed at her most vulnerable point. The old Martha would have flushed with shame, would have looked to Jedediah for defense. But the woman who had commanded a firefighting line the night before was different. She did not flush. She did not look away. She slowly finished ladling oatmeal into a bowl and looked Clem Pike directly in the eye. A small, wry smile touched her lips. "Well, Mr. Pike," she said, her voice calm and carrying a hint of dry humor, "a good fire needs good fuel to burn steady and strong. It is the weak, sputtering little flames you have to watch out for. They tend to burn themselves out with a lot of nasty smoke and not much heat." A few of the men choked back laughter. Billy, the young hand, grinned openly into his coffee cup. Clem's face turned a blotchy, furious red. He had been bested. His crude insult turned back on him with a wit that was sharper and far more effective than his own brand of malice. He snatched his bowl from the counter and retreated to the far end of a table, defeated. Later that day, a gnawing suspicion sent Martha back to the hay barn. She told herself she was checking to make sure there were no lingering sparks, but she was looking for something else. She carried a lantern. Though the big barn was filled with dusty shafts of afternoon light, she went to the spot where the fire had been set. The wood was charred, the ground a mess of ash and mud. She kicked at the debris with the toe of her boot, her eyes scanning the ground. And then she saw it, half buried in the grime. Small and innocuous, was a partially burned lamp wick. It was not a rag, it was a proper wick, the kind designed to draw oil and burn at a slow, steady rate. An incendiary device. She picked it up carefully, the metal tab at its base. The part used to adjust the flame was still intact. It was tarnished with soot, but she could just make out a small, stamped letter. It was a capital M. She stared at it, her breath catching in her throat. M for Marbury. It was not just suspicion anymore. It was proof. She closed her fist around the small piece of metal, its edges digging into her palm. She now held the key not just to a small, failed act of arson, but to the entire campaign of whispers, threats, and hate that had followed them since their first day in town. That night, the wind shifted. It came out of the south, hot and dry, moaning around the corners of the buildings. It was the fire wind. It rustled the cured, golden grass, making it whisper a dry, dangerous song. The entire prairie had become a tinderbox, waiting. Martha stood at her window, looking out at the vast, moonlit expanse. The threat was no longer a flicker in the dark. It was everywhere, surrounding them, a sea of dry fuel. If the real fire came now, it would not just lick at the walls of a barn. It would swallow the sky. The hot wind did not die down after sunset. It continued its restless patrol of the plains, a dry, sighing presence that carried the scent of dust and distant, sun-baked earth. It made the flame inside the cookhouse lantern flicker and dance, casting long, wavering shadows that seemed to have a life of their own. Samuel was asleep in his small cot in the corner, his face smooth and untroubled. He had passed buckets in the fire line, an earnest, determined look on his face, and the effort had exhausted him. Looking at him, Martha felt a familiar ache in her chest, a mix of fierce love and a deep, gnawing fear for the world she had brought him into. The kitchen was clean, the dishes were put away, and the lingering smell of the evening meal had been replaced by the clean scent of soap and the faint, ever-present aroma of old wood smoke. She should have been tired, but the night's energy, the hot, electric hum in the air, kept her awake. She sat at the long trestle table, her hands resting on the worn wood. The lamp wick she had found nestled safely in her apron pocket. It felt like a hot coal against her thigh. She heard the soft thud of his boots on the porch steps before she saw him. Jedediah appeared in the open doorway, a massive silhouette against the deep indigo of the night sky. He did not knock. The cookhouse had become a shared space, a neutral ground between the bunkhouse and the main ranch house. "Could not sleep," he said, his voice a low rumble. It was not an apology or an explanation, just a simple statement of fact. "The wind," Martha replied, nodding. "It sounds like it is looking for something." He came in and sat across from her, the heavy wooden bench groaning under his weight. He placed a small, round loaf of her sourdough bread on the table between them. She recognized it as the one she had set aside for his breakfast. He looked tired. The lines around his eyes were deeper than usual, and his uninjured arm rested on the table. His big fingers curled into a loose fist. "The men are on a rotating watch," he said. "2 men, 2 hours each, circling the perimeter." "That is wise." They sat in silence for a long moment. The only sounds the sighing of the wind and the gentle hiss of the lantern. The light caught the silver in his dark hair and softened the hard lines of his face. He was looking at his bandaged arm. "Fire takes things," he said, his voice so quiet she had to lean forward to hear. "It does not just burn wood and grass. It burns up years. It turns everything you have built into smoke and memory." Martha waited, sensing that this was more than just a comment on the night's events. This was something being pulled up from a deep, cold well. "I was not always alone here," he continued, his gaze distant, fixed on the flickering flame of the lamp. "I had a wife, Eleanor, and a son, Thomas. He was 5 years old." He paused, and the silence that followed was heavy with the weight of unspoken grief. Martha felt her own breath catch in her throat. It was a prairie fire, 10 years back, came up from the south, fast as a running horse, on a wind just like this one. We had fire breaks, water barrels, just like we do now. We thought we were ready, but the wind shifted. It threw embers a half-mile ahead of the fire line. The roof of the house caught first. His voice was flat, stripped of all emotion, the way a man's voice gets when he is describing something too terrible to feel. "I was out with the men, trying to turn the herd. Eleanor was supposed to take Thomas to the root cellar. It was stone-lined, safe, but the smoke, it must have confused her. They found them in the barn. She was holding him. The fire took the house, the barn, everything. When it was over, there was nothing left but the chimney stack, standing there like a tombstone. I rebuilt, but you cannot rebuild a life. You just build on top of the ashes." He finally looked at her, and in his clear blue eyes, she saw a desolation so profound it made her own troubles seem small and distant. He had not just lost a ranch. He had lost his world, and he had faced it with the same quiet, uncomplaining stoicism with which he faced everything else. The air in the small kitchen was thick with his pain. Martha thought of her own husband, taken by a slow, wasting sickness. She had mourned him. She had grieved. But this was different. This was a violence, a theft. She reached across the table and pushed the small loaf of bread toward him. "I am so sorry, Jedediah," she whispered. He just shook his head, a small, weary gesture. "No need to be sorry. It was a long time ago." He looked at her then, a real, searching look. "You have had your own share of hardship." It was her turn to look away, her gaze falling to her own hands, resting on the table. They were large, red-knuckled, practical hands, hands that had scrubbed floors, kneaded dough, and held her crying son. They were not the delicate, soft hands of a woman like Beatrice Marbury. They were the hands of a survivor. "I am tired," she confessed, the words coming out in a rush, as if a dam had broken inside her. "I am so tired of being sorry. From the moment I wake up to the moment I go to sleep. It feels like I am apologizing. I apologize for taking up too much room on the boardwalk. I apologize for the shadow I cast. I apologize for having a son to feed, for needing a job, for the space my body takes up in the world. I am tired of trying to make myself smaller. Jedediah, I am tired of apologizing for the simple fact that I exist." Her voice broke on the last word. She did not cry, but the raw, unvarnished truth of her confession hung in the air between them, as stark and real as his own story of loss. He had been hollowed out by a great, sudden tragedy. She was being worn away, grain by grain, by 1,000 daily cuts. He was silent for a long time, just watching her. Then he reached out his large, uninjured hand and broke the loaf of bread in half. He pushed one half across the table to her. It was a simple, profound gesture of communion, an offering. She took it, her fingers brushing against his. His hand was warm and calloused. a map of hard work and quiet strength. He moved then, not across the table, but around it. He sat on the bench beside her, not touching, but so close she could feel the heat from his body. The space between them was charged, filled with everything that had just been said and everything that had not. They ate the bread in silence, the soft, chewy crumb a comfort in their mouths. When they were finished, he took her hand, the one that was not holding the bread. He turned it over and looked at her palm, tracing the lines with his thumb. Her heart began to beat a slow, heavy rhythm against her ribs. "You have good hands, Martha," he said softly. "They are strong. They build things up. They feed people. There is nothing in this world to be sorry for in that." He looked up from her hand to her face. His eyes were no longer filled with the ghosts of the past. They were clear and present, and they were looking at her as if she were the only person in the world. He leaned in, slowly, giving her time to pull away. She did not. She could not. She was held fast by the simple, astonishing fact that this man, this good, quiet, solitary man, truly saw her. His lips met hers. It was not a kiss of passion, but of discovery. It was short and slow, clumsy in its honesty. It tasted of sourdough and coffee and a deep, unspoken loneliness. It was a question and an answer, a beginning and an end to a long, hard day. It was warm, and it was enough. When he pulled back, they just looked at each other, the lantern light flickering in their eyes. A silent promise passed between them, as real and binding as any spoken vow. "There will be breakfast tomorrow," it said, "and there will be someone here to eat it." Their quiet moment was shattered by a sound from far off in the darkness. It was faint at first, then clearer on a gust of wind, the frantic, metallic clang of a heavy bell being rung in alarm. It was a fire warning, not from their ranch, but from a neighbor to the south. Jedediah was on his feet in an instant, all the softness gone from his face, replaced by the sharp, focused attention of a commander. He went to the door and listened, his head cocked. Judging the distance and the direction of the sound, the wind was still hot, still blowing from the south, straight toward them. Martha came to stand beside him in the doorway. She could feel the fear again, cold and sharp. But this time, it was different. She was not alone in it. Jedediah reached out and took her hand again, his grip firm and sure. His eyes were fixed on the dark horizon. "If the fire comes back," he said, his voice a low, steady rumble against the moan of the wind, "we stand in the same line." He squeezed her hand, a brief, hard pressure that sealed the promise. They stood together on the threshold of the cookhouse, two solitary figures braced against the vast, dark prairie. The air that drifted in was hot and oppressive, and now, woven into the scent of dust and dry grass, was another, fainter smell, the thin, ugly perfume of distant smoke. The first sign was a change in the sky. The deep, star-dusted indigo of the night began to pulse with a faint, sick orange glow on the southern horizon. The hot wind, which had been moaning all evening, now carried a new scent on its breath, the sharp, ugly perfume of burning grass and wood smoke. The alarm bell from the neighboring ranch had fallen silent, swallowed by a new sound, a low, guttural roar that was growing steadily louder, the sound of 1,000 freight trains bearing down on them in the dark. Jedediah needed no bell. He was already moving, shouting orders that cut through the night's oppressive heat. "Silas, get the horses into the lower pasture. Cut the fences if you have to. Give them a chance to run, Billy. You and the rest." To the troughs, bucket lines on all four sides of the barn and the cookhouse. The ranch exploded into a frenzy of desperate, disciplined activity. Men ran, their faces grim and set in the flickering, distant light. The horses, smelling the smoke, screamed and kicked in their stalls, their eyes wide with terror. The air grew thick, tasting of cinders. A fine rain of gray ash began to fall, dusting their shoulders and hair like a malevolent snow. Then they saw it. It topped the rise to the south, a solid, moving wall of orange and black. A quarter-mile wide and 50 feet high. The prairie fire. It moved with a terrifying speed, consuming the dry grass with an insatiable hunger. The wind it generated itself fanning its own flames. It was not a fire. It was a living entity, a roaring beast of heat and destruction. The bucket brigades formed, long human chains stretching from the water troughs to the precious wooden buildings, the slap and slosh of the water, the grunts of exertion, the shouted commands, all of it seemed like a child's game against the sheer, overwhelming scale of the inferno. Martha shoved a sleeping, terrified Samuel into the root cellar beneath the cookhouse, a small, dark space that smelled of earth and potatoes. You stay here, no matter what you hear. Do you understand me, Samuel? No matter what. The boy, his face pale in the lantern light, just nodded, clutching a small wooden horse she had bought for him at the market. She shut the heavy wooden door, her heart breaking at the fear in his eyes. But as she turned back to the cookhouse, she saw that the men were concentrating their efforts on the main barn, where the stud bull and the milk cows were still trapped, and on the main ranch house, her cookhouse, and the smaller stables beside it, had only a few young hands throwing desperate buckets of water against its walls. The wind, in a cruel, predictable shift, was driving the main force of the fire directly toward them. A leader was needed, taking a deep breath that filled her lungs with smoke. Martha became that leader. "You two," she yelled at a pair of teenage ranch hands who were splashing water aimlessly. "Soak the blankets from the bunkhouse. Get them on the roof of the stable. And you," she pointed to another, "get that ladder over here, against the cookhouse wall. Now." To her own surprise, they obeyed instantly. Her size, so often a source of shame, now gave her an air of solid, unshakable authority. She was a boulder in the chaotic river of fear. Just as they got the ladder in place, Samuel emerged from the root cellar, his face streaked with tears and soot. "I am not staying in the dark alone. Mama, I want to help," he cried, his small voice thin against the roar of the fire. There was no time to argue. She looked at his determined face and saw a spark of the man he would become. "Then get in the line, son," she ordered, pointing to the bucket brigade. "Take a handle, pull your weight." He nodded, his fear replaced by a solemn purpose, and found a place between two older men. The heat was becoming unbearable, a physical blow that seared the lungs and baked the skin. The main fire front was still 100 yards away, but its vanguard had arrived, a storm of glowing red embers, carried on the wind, falling like deadly rain. They hissed and sizzled when they landed on wet wood, but where they found a dry spot, they immediately began to glow. Small seeds of destruction. One landed on the cookhouse roof, near the peak, in a spot the thrown water could not reach. A tiny wisp of smoke began to curl from a dry shingle. Martha saw it. Without a second thought, she hitched up her heavy skirts and began to climb the ladder, her movements surprisingly agile. The men below shouted at her to come down, but their voices were lost in the din. She reached the edge of the roof and hauled herself onto the steep, shingled pitch. The heat from below was intense, and the smoke billowed around her, making her eyes stream and her throat burn. She crawled toward the peak, a wet burlap sack she had grabbed clutched in one hand. She reached the smoldering ember and beat at it with the sack, her whole body shaking with the effort. The shingles smoked and sizzled, but the flame died. As she shifted her weight to crawl back down, another, larger ember landed on the hem of her thick calico dress. She felt a sudden, sharp heat against her leg. She looked down and saw a small orange flame greedily eating at the fabric. She cried out, beating at it with her bare hands, the smell of scorched cloth sharp in her nostrils. It was at that moment that the fire, in its final, furious assault, reached the line of cottonwood trees at the edge of the ranch yard. One of the largest trees, its core dry and rotten, exploded in a shower of sparks and flame. A huge, burning limb cracked and fell, crashing directly onto the roof of the small stable beside the cookhouse. The old timber roof, already weakened by the heat, gave way with a sound like a gunshot. Samuel, who had been in the bucket line directly beside the stable, screamed as the structure began to collapse inward, sending a shower of sparks and burning debris raining down around him. Martha, from her perch on the cookhouse roof, saw it all. She forgot the fire on her own dress, forgot the inferno raging around her. Her son was in danger. She scrambled and half slid down the steep roof, landing heavily on her feet on the ground below, her ankle twisting painfully. She ignored it. She ran, limping, and threw herself at Samuel, wrapping her large, soft body around him like a shield just as a heavy, smoking roof beam crashed down where he had been standing. The beam struck her across the back and shoulders, driving her to her knees with a grunt of pure agony. The impact knocked the wind from her lungs, and for a moment, the world went black, filled with the sound of splintering wood and the roar of the fire. But her arms never loosened their hold on her son. Through the haze of smoke and pain, a figure emerged, a giant moving through the hellscape. It was Jedediah. He had seen the collapse, seen her fall. His face was a mask of terror and fury. He reached them in 3 long strides, and without a word, he bent and scooped them both into his arms. He lifted Martha and Samuel as if they weighed nothing, his bandaged arms straining, his face a mask of grim determination. He cradled them against his chest, turning his own broad back to the heat and the falling embers, and carried them away from the collapsing, burning stable, out into the relative safety of the cleared yard. He set them down gently, far from the flames. "Are you hurt?" he demanded, his voice rough with fear as he patted out the last smoldering patch on her skirt. Martha shook her head. Though her back screamed in protest, she looked at Samuel, who was crying silently, his face buried in her skirts. "We are all right," she gasped, her voice hoarse from the smoke. The battle raged for another hour, a desperate, close-quarters fight. But the main fire front, its fuel momentarily spent on the firebreak in the cottonwoods, began to lose its momentum. The wind, as fickle as it was cruel, began to die down. The roar softened to a hiss and a crackle. The men, exhausted but relentless, pushed it back, dousing the last of the flames that threatened the buildings they had held. The ranch was saved. As the false dawn began to gray the eastern sky, a scene of devastation was revealed. The small stable was a smoking ruin. A corner of the barn was charred and blackened. The prairie for miles to the south was a blackened, smoking wasteland, but the main house, the bunkhouse, and the cookhouse still stood. Jedediah, Martha, and Samuel stood together in the yard, their face black with soot, their clothes reeking of smoke. They were exhausted, bruised, and aching, but they were alive. They looked at the blackened earth, at the smoking ruins, and then at each other. In that moment, surrounded by the warm ashes of what had been lost, they were not a rancher, a cook, and her son. They were 3 people who had walked through fire and saved one another, a family, not yet named, forged in the heat of disaster. As the sun rose properly, casting a clean, morning light on the destruction, Jedediah's foreman approached, his face grim. "Jed, you need to see this." He led them to the edge of the burned prairie, where the fire had first swept onto Hollister land. The ground was littered with wads of what looked like oily burlap and twine, the same kind of tinder that had been used at the barn, and burned into the soft earth. Clear as day were the tracks of 2 shod horses. They were not from the Hollister ranch. Jedediah knew the shoeing patterns of every horse he owned. One set was distinctive, from a horse that had a slight limp and wore a weighted shoe on its right forefoot. "That is Enoch Marbury's bay mare," Jedediah said, his voice deadly quiet. "I would know that track anywhere." Martha reached into her apron pocket and pulled out the small, soot-stained lamp wick with the stamped letter M on its base. She held it out on the palm of her hand. Jedediah looked at it, then at the tracks, then at her. The last piece of the puzzle fell into place. His face was like carved stone, but a cold fire burned in his eyes, more dangerous than the one they had just fought. He looked from the evidence of arson to the devastation around them, to the woman and the boy who had almost been lost in it. He closed his hand over the lamp wick, his knuckles white. "Justice has to have a voice," he said, his voice low and hard as granite. "I am taking this to the circuit judge." Justice on the frontier did not arrive in a black robe or with the tap of a gavel. It arrived on horseback, in the form of Circuit Judge Harlan Blackwood, a man whose face looked like it had been carved from saddle leather and whose only law book was a well-worn Bible and an even more well-worn Colt Peacemaker. Court was convened where it was convenient, which, in redemption, was the saloon. The whiskey bottles were cleared from the bar, and the judge set up his table on the small, dusty stage normally reserved for a piano player of questionable talent. The entire town seemed to be crammed into the large, smoky room. They stood shoulder to shoulder, their faces a mixture of morbid curiosity and nervous anticipation. It was a spectacle, better than a traveling medicine show. On one side of the room stood Jedediah Hollister, Martha, and Samuel. Jedediah was a silent, immovable mountain. Martha, in her best mended dress, held her head high, though her hands were clenched so tightly in the folds of her skirt that her knuckles were white. Samuel stood beside her, his small hand holding hers, his expression one of solemn gravity. On the other side were the Marburys. Enoch's face was a mottled purple, a combination of fury and indignation. Beatrice sat stiffly in a chair someone had brought for her, fanning herself with a lace fan as if the very air breathed by the common folk was an offense. Behind them, looking pale and shifty, stood Clem Pike and two other Marbury ranch hands. Judge Blackwood began without ceremony, his voice a gravelly boom that commanded immediate silence. "Jedediah Hollister, you have brought a serious charge of arson against your neighbor, Enoch Marbury. This is a fire and brimstone accusation in this country. You had best have more than smoke to show me." Jedediah stepped forward. He did not raise his voice. He did not gesture wildly. He simply spoke the truth in his plain, direct way. He described the smoldering rags at the base of his barn, the oily stain on the ground, and the fire that had nearly taken his entire ranch. He laid the small, burned lamp wick with the stamped M on the judge's table. This was found in the ashes of that first fire. "Judge," he said, "Marbury is the only man in this county who buys his wicks from the supplier in St. Louis that uses that mark." A low murmur went through the crowd. Enoch Marbury surged forward. "That is a lie. It proves nothing. You could have gotten that anywhere." Judge Blackwood silenced him with a glare. "You will have your turn, Marbury, or you will have a night in the blacksmith's shed to cool your temper. Your choice." Enoch subsided, sputtering. Jedediah continued, his voice as steady as a rock. He described the great prairie fire, the wall of flame that had descended on them in the night. The fire was not an accident of nature. "Judge, it was set, deliberately, and it was set on my land." He then called his witness, a quiet, stoop-shouldered farmer named Peterson, whose small homestead lay between the Hollister and Marbury ranches. Peterson, twisting his hat in his hands, testified that on the night of the fire, he had been up with a sick cow. He had seen two riders coming from the direction of the Marbury ranch, heading south toward the area where the fire had started. He had not seen their faces in the dark, but he had recognized one of the horses. It was Mr. Marbury's bay mare, Peterson said, his voice barely a whisper, but carrying in the dead silence of the room. "The one with the limp. I would know that gait anywhere." "She was carrying a man, and he was carrying something that smelled of kerosene." The crowd murmured again, louder this time. The weight of evidence was beginning to shift. All eyes turned to Clem Pike and the other two hands, who were now sweating freely, their expressions a mixture of fear and guilt. Judge Blackwood leaned forward, his eyes boring into Clem Pike. "Son, I have been doing this a long time. I know the look of a man who is carrying another man's guilt, and right now, you look heavier than a freight wagon. Who were the two riders, Mr. Peterson saw. Clem swallowed, his Adam's apple bobbing in his thin throat. He looked at Enoch Marbury, who gave him a slight, threatening shake of his head, but then he looked at Jedediah Hollister, whose cold, steady gaze promised a different, more immediate kind of reckoning. Clem was a bully, and like all bullies, he was a coward at his core. He broke. "It was me," he blurted out, the words spilling from him in a panicked rush. "It was me and Tom. But it was not my idea. I swear it was not my idea." Then, whose idea was it? The judge pressed, his voice like the crack of a whip. Clem's eyes darted to Enoch, then to Beatrice. He saw the cold fury on her face, and his resolve crumbled completely. He would not take the fall for her. "It was her," he cried, pointing a trembling finger at Beatrice Marbury. "It was Mrs. Marbury. She told us to do it." A collective gasp went through the saloon. Beatrice shot to her feet, her face a mask of outrage. "That is a preposterous lie. This stable hand is trying to save his own miserable hide." But Clem was not finished. The dam had burst, and the whole filthy story came flooding out. "She paid us. She said Mr. Hollister was getting too big for his britches. She said he had gone soft over his new cook." He spat the word out, looking at Martha with pure venom. "She said we needed to knock him down a peg, ruin him with fire, and ruin her with rumors." Those were her words, fire and rumors. The crowd was utterly silent now, but the quality of the silence had changed. It was no longer the silence of entertainment. It was the heavy, uncomfortable silence of collective shame. The whispers, the jokes, the sneers that had been directed at Martha for weeks were now laid bare for what they were: not harmless fun, but the kindling for a fire that could have killed people. The townspeople looked at each other, and then they looked away, unable to meet anyone's gaze. They had been complicit. They had been Beatrice Marbury's willing audience. In that thick, suffocating silence, a single, clear voice spoke. It was Samuel. He stepped forward, letting go of his mother's hand, and looked not at the judge, not at the Marburys, but at the faces of the townspeople. "My mother fed you through the dry spell," he said, his voice small but carrying the undeniable weight of truth. "When your own gardens were dust, you ate her bread." It was a simple statement, but it struck home with the force of a physical blow. It was true. They remembered the market days, the pies and breads that had supplemented their own meager stores. They remembered the woman they had mocked, the woman who had nourished them. Judge Blackwood's face was grim. He looked at the Marburys, his expression one of utter contempt. "Enoch Marbury, Beatrice Marbury, this court finds you guilty of conspiracy to commit arson, a crime for which men have been hanged in this territory. But since no life was lost, I will be lenient." He leaned forward. "You will pay Jedediah Hollister for every head of cattle lost, for every building damaged, and for the wages of his men for 1 full year. And you, Beatrice Marbury, will find that the society you hold so dear has a long memory for this kind of poison." The verdict was absolute. Enoch Marbury looked like a broken man, his bluster gone, replaced by the gray look of financial ruin. But Beatrice's punishment was more immediate. As she stood there, sputtering in disbelief, the women who had once been her devoted followers, the ones who had laughed at Martha with her at the market, began to turn away. They physically turned their backs on her, creating a small, silent circle of exclusion around her. Her social reign in redemption was over. Jedediah gave a single, curt nod to the judge. The public battle was won. He turned and gently placed a hand on Martha's back, guiding her and Samuel toward the door. As they walked through the crowd, people made way for them, their faces a mixture of apology and respect. The mockery was gone, replaced by a shamefaced deference. As they stepped out of the dark saloon and into the bright, clean sunlight, a small group of women detached themselves from the crowd and hurried after them. It was the banker's wife and 2 of the farmers' wives. They stopped in front of Martha, their gazes fixed on their own dusty shoes. "Mrs. McGray," the banker's wife began, her voice hesitant. We were wondering, if it is not too much trouble, could you teach us how to make your buttermilk biscuits? They are the lightest we have ever tasted." Martha looked at their faces, at their genuine, fumbling attempt to make amends. A year ago, a month ago, even a week ago, she would have ducked her head, mumbled an apology for being in their way, and given them the recipe just to make them leave. But as she stood there in the afternoon sun, with Jedediah's warm hand still on her back and her son's hand held firmly in hers, she felt a profound sense of peace settle over her. She was no longer a victim of their judgment. A slow, genuine smile spread across her face, a smile that reached her eyes and lit them from within. It was a smile completely free of apology. "I would be happy to," she said. She watched them hurry away, clutching the verbal recipe like a treasure. The public accounts were settled. Her honor had been restored, her worth acknowledged. But as she turned and looked up at Jedediah, at the quiet strength in his face, she knew that the most important questions had not been asked in the courtroom. They stood together, a silent, unbreachable unit, the dust of the town swirling around their feet. The noise of the trial faded behind them, leaving only a new, more complicated silence. The world now knew who they were to everyone else. But what, she wondered, were they to each other? Rebuilding was a language the West understood. It was spoken not in words, but in the rhythmic ring of hammers on new timber, the rasp of a handsaw through fresh-cut pine, and the grunts of men hoisting a heavy beam into place. The fire had taken much, but it had left a foundation of will. And on that foundation, the Hollister Ranch began to rise from its own ashes. The work was hard and relentless, from the first gray light of dawn until the last embers of sunset faded from the sky. What surprised Martha was that they were not alone. On the second day of clearing the rubble of the burned stable, 3 wagons had rolled up the long lane. They were not filled with gawkers, but with men from the town and neighboring farms, their sleeves already rolled up, their hands carrying saws and hammers of their own. They did not offer words of pity. They offered the solid, unspoken solidarity of their labor. The shame of the trial had given way to a quiet, communal act of penance. They had let the fire of rumor burn. Now they would help quench the results of a real one. Martha, in turn, fed them all. Her cookhouse became the heart of the entire operation, a bustling center of warmth and sustenance. She baked dozens of loaves of bread, simmered enormous pots of rich beef stew, and kept a seemingly bottomless pot of coffee brewing over the fire. She moved through her domain with a new, unhurried confidence, her presence as solid and reassuring as the stone hearth of her stove. Her new standing in the community was cemented not by the trial, but by what she did in the weeks that followed. She noticed the teenage sons of the farmers and ranch hands, boys of 14 or 15, all long limbs and clumsy energy, often left to their own devices while their fathers worked. They were a pack of restless colts, full of undirected strength that too often curdled into mischief. One afternoon, she found 2 of them in a scuffle behind the bunkhouse over a dropped coin. The next day, she put up a notice at the general store. It was simple and written in her neat, clear hand. She was starting a kitchen class for any boy over the age of 12 who was not afraid of hard work. The lessons would be free. The only payment required was discipline. A half-dozen boys showed up the first Saturday, a mix of curiosity and bravado. They slouched into her cookhouse, expecting a gentle lesson on baking cookies. They were mistaken. Martha handed each of them an apron and a scrubbing brush. Their first lesson was on how to properly scour a pot until it shone. Their second was on how to peel 100 pounds of potatoes without complaint. There is no honor in a sloppy job, she told a lanky boy named Daniel, whose potato peelings were thick enough to make a meal of their own. She did not raise her voice. She simply took the peeler from his hand, showed him how to take off only the skin, and then placed it back in his palm. The way you do your work is the way you see yourself. Do you see yourself as wasteful, as careless, or as someone who does a thing right because that is the only way to do it? The boy flushed, but he took the lesson. Over the next few weeks, the boys learned to bake bread that rose high and light. They learned to butcher a side of beef, to make a stew that could hold a man for a full day's work, and to keep a kitchen so clean you could eat off the floor. More than that, they learned to stand up straight, to look a person in the eye when they spoke, and to take pride in the competence of their own hands. Martha was not just teaching them to cook, she was teaching them the recipe for self-respect. Samuel, meanwhile, was undergoing his own quiet transformation. He no longer clung to his mother's skirts. He had become a fixture of the ranch, a small, serious shadow who trailed after the old hand. Silas, he learned to mend a bridle, to properly groom a horse, and to tell by the look of the sky whether the weather would hold. The men, who had once ignored him, now treated him with a gruff, affectionate respect. They called him Little Boss, and saved him the sweetest apples from the supply wagon. The hunched, fearful posture of the boy who had first walked into redemption was gone, replaced by the steady, balanced stance of a boy who knew, without a doubt, that he belonged. The new stable was finished by the time the first cool winds of autumn began to whisper down from the high country. The smell of fresh pine and sawdust had finally chased away the last ghost of smoke. Life settled into a new, comfortable rhythm, a rhythm of shared work and shared meals. The question that had hung in the air after the trial remained unspoken, but it was present in the quiet evenings when Jedediah would come to the cookhouse porch after the work was done. He and Martha would sit together on the top step, not talking much, just watching the stars prick the vast, dark canopy of the sky. The silence between them was not empty. It was full of a deep, shared understanding, a comfort that went beyond words. One such evening, when a sliver of a moon hung in the sky and the air was crisp with the promise of a frost, Jedediah broke the comfortable silence. "The Marbury payment came today," he said, looking out at the dark line of the horizon. "The first one. It is more than enough to cover the lumber and the lost stock." Martha nodded, waiting. She knew this was not all he had to say. "I have been thinking, Martha," he continued, turning to look at her. In the faint moonlight, his face was serious, his eyes clear and direct. "The cookhouse, it does more than just feed my men. What you did with those boys, what you do here every day, it feeds this whole place in a way I cannot measure. It is its own operation, its own profit." He paused, choosing his words with care. "I do not want you to be on my payroll anymore. I want you to be a partner, an equal share of whatever profit the kitchen makes from selling baked goods in town, or from feeding extra hands during a roundup. Your work should build your own future, not just mine." Martha was stunned into silence. A partnership. It was a gesture of respect so profound it took her breath away. He was not offering her a place as a dependent, but as an equal, the builder of her own fortunes tied to his own. "Jedediah, I do not know what to say," she stammered. He reached out and took her hand, his large, warm fingers closing around hers. "You do not have to say anything to that. It is just a matter of business, of what is right." He looked down at their joined hands. "But there is another matter." His thumb stroked the back of her hand, a slow, gentle gesture. "This ranch, it is a place of business. It is a piece of land, but for the first time in 10 years, it is starting to feel like something else." He looked up, his gaze holding hers, and his voice dropped to a low, quiet rumble. "If you wanted to call this place home, Martha, if you and Samuel wanted to call it your home, well, the main house has a lot of empty rooms." It was not a declaration of love in the way the storybooks told it. There were no flowery words, no grand pronouncements. It was a simple, solid, practical offering, as real and sturdy as the man himself. He was offering her a partnership in his life, just as he had offered her a partnership in his business. He was offering her a place to finally stop running, to finally stop apologizing, and to simply be. Tears welled in her eyes. But for the first time in a long, long time, they were not tears of sorrow or shame. They were tears of a deep, quiet joy. A joy so overwhelming it felt like coming home after a lifetime in exile. She could not speak. She simply leaned into him, resting her head on his broad, solid shoulder, and squeezed his hand. It was all the answer he needed. The next morning, the sun rose on a world transformed. A hard frost had fallen overnight, and the blackened, burned prairie was coated in a delicate, sparkling layer of white. As the sun's first rays touched the ground, the frost began to melt, and a soft, gentle steam rose from the warm ashes, as if the earth itself were breathing a sigh of release in the black, charred soil. Almost invisible, tiny shoots of new green grass were already pushing their way toward the light. Jedediah and Martha stood on the porch, a shared mug of hot coffee steaming between their hands. She leaned against him, his arm wrapped securely around her shoulders. It felt right, solid. He bent his head, and she lifted her face to his. The kiss they shared was not like the first one, hesitant and discovering. This kiss was sure and slow and deep with the promise of 1,000 sunrises to come. It was the kiss of two people who had found their anchor in a stormy world. A shout of pure, boyish joy made them turn. Samuel was running across the yard, chasing a stray calf that had wandered from the herd. He ran with his head up, his arms pumping, his small body a picture of unbridled, confident energy. He was not looking back. He was running toward the future, a future that was as wide and as full of promise as the endless Texas sky. The whispers in town would likely never die completely. Rumors have a longer life than the people who speak them. But here, on this ranch, built on warm ashes, the truth was a living, breathing thing. It was in the taste of fresh bread, in the sound of a boy's laughter, and in the quiet strength of two people standing together against the dawn. The word belonging was never spoken. It did not need to be. It was being built every single day. Thank you for listening to our story. Please comment where you are listening from so we can all connect and share our thoughts. And do not forget to subscribe to my channel Wild West Night, like the video, and support us further by pressing the hype button so this story in the video can be heard by more people.